Welcome back to another DEAP podcast. I'm D,
And I'm Cast.
and today we're going to be talking about executive power or executive privilege. And I think for the purposes of these discussions, we're going to attempt to limit it to at least be based in the discussion of the United States executive officer. In other words, the President of the United States. What types of power does that position hold? I think we'll go into some lower positions of judges, Supreme Court judges, and the likes. But for the most part, we're going to be sticking to the American system. Agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. So how would you define executive power or executive privilege? I think those
Well,
are those
there
interchangeable?
um, I guess so. So basically, in the United States, there are specific powers given to the president. And so when I'm thinking about executive power, I'm thinking about what the president of the United States actually has power over, and what the president can do without involving the other areas of government. So without involving Congress and or the Senate, and without involving the judiciary system at all.
I,
So
I
what?
I agree to some degree, but not entirely. So I think that the executive power is what are the actions that can be taken by the executive officer. The executive privilege is the
Mhm,
ability to use those powers. So in other words, while executive power may remain for the position,
mhm.
an individual may lose the privilege to exercise those powers.
Yeah,
So
and I mean there are checks and balances in the case. So just calling that out, that the presidents can make executive orders and make decisions, but if they are found unconstitutional or are found to be uh, just bad, the Congress has the ability to overturn them if Congress is in a unanimous agreement, which is
not unanimous. At
well,
least in the U.S., it's if the
yeah,
president vetoes a bill and sends it back to Congress, the Congress needs 2/3 majority to be able to overpower the power of the president.
correct.
But that does not mean that the president can make laws unless there's a 2/3 majority against him. It's
Mhm.
Congress makes the laws, the executive branch executes the law. That's why it's
Yeah,
called the
for
executive branch.
for vetoing, for vetoes, yes.
Right.
For executive orders and things like that, the Congress can overturn those, or the judiciary system can overturn those
Right.
if
So
found unconstitutional.
I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to executive power versus
Mhm.
executive privilege and a
Yeah,
specific concrete example. One of the more clear ones is the president has the right to go to war, but does not have the right to declare war. So, in other words, take
correct.
actions that are involved in war, attack other countries, at least for, I think,
Mhm.
60 days, because that is the time given for Congress to step in, have discussions on whether or not we should stay in the war. So, the president has the ability to act in a warring way. He has that power and the privilege, but after 60 days, he loses that privilege relative to that particular
Mhm.
conflict. And
Yeah.
I'm using he because so far every president of the U.S. has been
Mhm.
a he, so I'm going to continue this conversation using he.
Yep. And that's all right with me. Just also from a pedantry point of view, using he is appropriate grammatically as the English language.
As
If
I'm the
you
one speaking. If I
correct,
don't know the particular gender of the person being spoken about, the speaker assumes their own gender on the person.
they use their own pronouns on the person.
Correct.
You don't really assume the gender; you just use your own pronouns.
Man, we are getting
Um,
really off topic right off the bat.
yeah. So everything you said is about declaring war is correct. The president has the ability to launch military operations. They can authorize deployment of troops and launch nuclear weapons unilaterally. However, the constitutional ability to declare war rests only in Congress's hands.
Right.
Uh,
So acting in a warring way is not the same as declaring war. So that would
mm,
be a difference in what power is had, and that power only is maintained for a certain duration, only for the first 60 days of those activities, after which the privilege is removed, even if the power still remains, as the executive officer has the power but has lost the privilege to act on that power.
mhm.
So I think that it's a subtle difference but it's a difference that I wanted to call out before we continue the discussion. So let's focus on executive power. What are the things that an executive officer, in particular the president,
Mhm.
should have, and what is the reason for them having that? Should we have a single point person as an executive officer that can
Mhm.
act with powers associated with ultimate executive authority?
Yeah. So breaking down what is currently possible, the president can make executive orders, which are subject to judicial review and interpretation. But the president has the ability to put those orders out. They have certain abilities when they are, in terms of legislation. We already mentioned vetoing. Um, is a power that the president has, as well as some other things like president has the ability to pardon people that they deem deserving, or I guess if that judges decide
Ba- ba-
should be
ba-
pardoned.
Basically, you're giving examples of they are the be all end all of how the law gets executed. They can choose, hey, they can say, this person was found guilty under the law, but I have choice over how that law is executed. Therefore, I am pardoning this person as we are not going to execute the law against you,
Hmm.
or that we are going to execute the law differently against you.
Yep.
And the reason for that is having a particular point person to be able to put a stop
Hmm.
to abuses or lack of action taken in the rest of the government. So I think part of the reason for having an executive officer is having a single person that can say yes or no to a particular action. And I think the best example of that is wartime. All right, we're about to go to war, or
Hmm.
we're 9/11. Let's use that as an example. We're, as a country, actively under attack. We've been hit multiple times. The amount of time that it would take to get an emergency session of Congress with all senators, that's 500 people, senators and House of Representatives, get 500 people together and get them to come to a consensus and agree on actions to be taken could take on the order of days. And
Yep.
it may take a full day just to get everyone together, and then to get everyone informed on what's going on, get them up to speed, and then start having discussions, put up proposals, discuss the proposals, revise the proposals, and then make a decision. Even on something that's very clear cut of, hey, we're under attack, that could take on the order of days. And when you're under
Yep.
attack, days are critical. You need a single person to say, this is what we're doing, and this is
Hmm.
my execution of the law to the best of my ability, and I'm trying to defend the country and what it stands for. We can decide exact specifics of how to handle the ongoing situation, but I think
Hmm.
executive power in the American sense is aimed at acting on the short term
So to an
risks.
extent, those are often called emergency powers, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to react very quickly without the need to pull any other forms of government. So they're the Constitution does not actually give the president those powers in terms of a national emergency. But it doesn't mean it hasn't been used that way, and there are certain implied powers that the president has without necessarily perfectly stating them. But the basically, if the if the executive branch, meaning the president, it does a certain thing with emergency powers, if Congress doesn't fight it, then it happens. So, for example, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Frank FDR evoked emergency powers to put all Japanese Americans into internment camps,
Yep.
and that was something that he chose to do without pulling in the other forms. And ultimately, the Supreme Court did uphold that order.
And regardless of whether or not you agree with the internment camps that were created, at the time, there was a world war going on. All of a sudden, we're being brought into it because one of the members of that world war suddenly actively attacked a naval base. All
Mhm.
right, we are actively under attack. This is a situation where we are now basically at war, and I need to start taking actions to protect the country. That was an action taken. Most of the country agreed with that action. So, regardless of whether or not we look back on history and say that it was right or wrong,
Hmm.
The people of the time that had the power to reverse that decision decided not to, which meant their inaction agreed with the action taken. And I think that that's an important aspect to bring up about executive power, is that executive power only goes so far as the people that are executing the orders that the point person gives
Hmm.
is not, their power only goes as far as those people are willing to follow the orders. So,
Correct.
as an example, and let's take a pretty extreme example. Let's say Trump, being the current president at the time of recording, let's say he wakes up and says, police go door to door and kill every firstborn child of every family. Unilaterally, equality, kill everyone's firstborn.
All right. So Pharaoh Trump initiates this order.
Right. So Pharaoh, I like that. Pharaoh Trump says kill the firstborn. What do you think happens? Because technically speaking, I think under the law,
not, yeah.
Under the law, I think you could argue that if he views something going on, that he is supposed to be the person that knows the most about what's going on internationally and with foreign affairs and wars. If we believe that we're going to be attacked by a religious extremist nation, unless we perform some religious act, killing the firstborn is related to a religious act, particularly in Christianity and Judaism. And I'm not saying that that's what Christians and Jews do. I'm saying that that's something that happened in the Bible. So if he's getting a threat directly from the leader of another nation saying, unless you go out and kill the firstborn, we're going to attack you and make it even worse. So there could be a reason for him to do that in association with acts of war. But if other people don't know that, what do you think would happen?
I believe most police officers would not listen, partly because they probably they might be a firstborn child themselves, or they might have a firstborn child. They might have a child. Also,
right. So
I just did a quick double check. Donald Trump is not a firstborn child, so he would himself wouldn't be at risk.
It's very like himself to not kill himself.
Right.
So in this particular circumstance, because most of the country doesn't agree with that particular action, while he has the law behind him to make that executive action, it wouldn't be enforced by the people who are responsible for enforcing the decisions that he makes. So let's take the flip side of that, and I want to bring up a book that I had read, Ordinary Men, which deals with police officers in Poland that were basically forced to carry out the actions of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party believed that killing Jews was okay. And that was from the top down. The upper echelons and the leaders of the Nazi Party said the final solution for Germany is to kill all the Jews, and we need to actually eliminate them, not just remove them from the country. Moving out into Poland, Poland didn't agree with that, but the leadership did, even trickling down to police chiefs. So in that case, most of the people enforcing the law or enforcing the decisions made by the executive section of the government agreed with the decisions that were being made. And so they were telling their police officers, hey, here's how you take a person out into a field, shoot him in the back of the head. And while the individuals at the very bottom layer that were actually pulling the triggers didn't agree with it, it made them sick to their stomachs and saying, no, how could I possibly do this? I'm killing someone when they haven't done anything to me and I don't see a reason for killing them. If enough people in the upper echelons of the government and people in authority say, this is what you're doing, this is for the good of the country, you need to do this, the camaraderie associated with being in those positions of being around other officers that you don't want to let them down in executing out the law, as soon as the support gets down far enough in the leadership, you can tell police officers, this is what you're doing, this is what the rest of the country agrees with, you need to kill these people. And they ended up doing it, even though it made them sick to their stomachs. They would decide who to kill because, well, I can't kill this person. I can't bring myself to kill a pregnant woman, but on behalf to make up for the fact that I couldn't do that, I'll go kill 3 more people. That was the type of rationale that they were coming up with because they hated what they were doing so much, but because they were told to from the middle echelons and not just the upper echelons, that type of order can come to be, even on the lowest level where people are actually pulling the triggers. So
Mhm.
again, to bring it back in, I think that it's important to recognize that there's a certain point at which the point person or the person with full executive power loses that power if they go too much to an
Yeah, there's
extreme
a
relative to the rest of the power structure in the
right.
government.
And that's why you didn't see in Nazi Germany, you didn't see immediately saying, "Let's kill all the Jews." It was more of let's just identify all the Jews and
Yep.
make it known who they are. Okay, now let's start, taking away their privileges and their powers one by
Take away
one.
their
And
homes.
right, we're gonna stop them from getting business licenses. Okay, let's start putting them into these camps. Oh, now that they're in these camps, let's start treating them like shit. Oh, and now let's start killing them. And it was
Right.
a
So
gradual
it was,
change.
while the idea was there from the upper echelons, so from the people that did have the executive authority, they wanted to my understanding, they wanted to eliminate Jews right from the get go.
Mhm.
That is not the opinion. That's not how the people that were enforcing the law, the police officers out on the ground and the soldiers, that's not how they were brought to that idea. They were slowly warmed up to it, which is
Mhm.
why I think if Trump just woke up and said, "Let's kill the firstborn child," that wouldn't go over well,
Right.
and it would have to be worked up to for a very long period of time, because in the current political climate, neither of the parties agrees with that. And if Trump did decide to make that type of executive order, he would be very quickly removed from office, or at least removed from being able to make
Well, that
executive
executive order
orders.
would be overturned very quickly because I don't know. I don't think either side of party lines would particularly want firstborn children to be killed.
Absolutely. I think people on both of the extremes of both parties would say, no, we're not
Mhm.
okay with this. And you'd probably have the first in history of having a complete unanimous vote to say, no, we're not okay with this.
Yeah.
But again, in the counterexample of Nazi Germany, if you have a majority of the people in the upper echelons that are actually moving that law down to the lower echelons of like, okay, exactly how are we going to go through the logistics of this? If they start to agree with the person with that point power, then that point power actually maintains its power. So there's a difference between power of law and power of action. And I think that power of law may be unlimited, but the power of action is limited by the willingness of the people under you to actually enforce your decisions. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, if the power that you hold is limited by the willingness of the people under you to execute it, that means that the more people you have that are being used to enforce your rulings, the less extreme your executive orders can be. So, in other words, your orders, in order to actually be enforced, have to align at least somewhat with the mainstream ideology of the time.
Uh, yeah. I would more of it needs to be within the mainstream enough such that the
Within the Overton window.
yeah, you are within the bounds where it would be accepted even if it's not totally mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, you can slowly push what is and isn't acceptable. You find the mainstream and you go to the very edge of it, and then you've kind of pushed that edge away after you've gotten that
It,
order in.
with each executive order, you may end up moving the Overton window slightly over in the
Mhm.
direction that you want it to move.
Yep.
And I I think that that's worth considering, that you can move what normal is, but at the same time, you with that ideology, or with that argument that I just formulated, you could have unlimited executive authority on paper, whereas within execution, that would not be the reality. You wouldn't be able to do anything, but having the unlimited power on paper means that if a particular action or if a particular event happens, like 9/11, where the Overton window drastically changes and shoots off to one side all of the sudden, then the person in executive authority isn't limited on paper or judicially, they can just say, hey, well, here's where the Overton window is. I'm going to move over to the extreme of the Overton window, but the Overton window can move and not be limited by the laws on paper. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an argument for having unlimited power for the executive officer on paper, at least for the short terms. That for short-term responses, having unlimited power is necessary because you can act only within the Overton window, because otherwise you
Mm-hmm.
lose support from the people that are actually executing your executive orders. But it permits for fast reaction times where we don't have to wait for a consensus among hundreds of individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does allow for fast reaction times, but it there's the being overturned is likely to happen or being completely ignored.
Absolutely. And if you
And
make an executive action or an executive order that people are willing to enforce, the rest of the government and Congress may not be willing to maintain that as law, and they may come together to make a new law saying, no, this enforcing this particular action is no longer within the bounds of the law. That will take time, so the law may be enforced in a particular way that is later
mm-hmm.
deemed disagreeable by Congress, but
Mm-hmm.
it at least, again, gives a short period of time where actions can be taken, and if Congress then disagrees, they can decide, hey, we're actually going to change how the law is written and how the law is going to be enforced, or should be enforced, and the executive, whoever is holding executive power, can make their own other interpretations of that, because the
Yeah,
purpose of Congress is to make the laws. The executive branch executes the laws.
yeah. And I pulling up a relatively recent example of something that was an executive order that was put into place that was marked, or that was found to be unconstitutional, and then actually found a provision of which was put back in and is still in place, is um, the executive order that Donald Trump put out about protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. Basically, he barred um, any persons, any citizens of 7 countries from entering the U.S. whatsoever. And there were a lot of things that were found wrong with this, partially talking about people that were permanent
Mm-hmm.
residents of the United States that were citizens of those countries that
Mm-hmm.
had been there visiting family, suddenly couldn't re-enter their home in the U.S. People that were carrying dual citizenship initially, if they were dual citizens of the U.S. and of one of those
Mm-hmm.
7 countries, they still couldn't enter.
So I think
Um,
that's a perfect example to bring up, because should the president have the power to do that? That the power to limit people coming from a particular country. Also, at the time of recording, the coronavirus in China is starting to spread very quickly within China, and we've had a couple of cases in the U.S. So it may be important for a point decision maker to be able to say people from that country are no longer allowed to freely travel here because you want to protect your citizenry.
mhm.
Now, you can make that order, and then the courts can go through and say, okay, is that a valid interpretation of the law? Should we
Mhm.
actually make this official? Should we change it? Is it just going to be a temporary thing? So I think that maintaining that power is important, but in the example that you gave of limiting from 7 countries and just
Mhm.
people from those 7 countries can't come over, saying, nope, that's actually not, we find that not to be valid within the Constitution. So while it
Yep.
has been executed up to this point, it's no longer going to be executed. And that's within
Yeah.
the realms of Congress. And it took a really long time for them to finally come to that decision. But having that power is important so that the president can act in a way that in the short term limits damages that may end up happening to the country with an unforeseen threat, and then the long-term decision can be made by Congress. And that's really what executive action is for. Short-term action. Congress is meant for long-term action. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Would you
Yeah,
agree with what
I
I
think
just?
a lot of executive orders do fall into that category. Not all of them, though, um, but a lot of them end up being for short-term action. Um, so maybe in the event of Pearl Harbor, I guess to
Short-term
get the
action
bearings
is we need
straight.
to respond. Let's deploy the fleet. And long-term action is okay. We've deployed the fleet.
Well,
How
so
are we
that's
actually going to go to war?
yeah. So that was not so much, I guess, when I'm talking about executive order, I was referring back to the internment camps
Oh,
and
sure, sure.
whether or not we agree posthumously with the decisions of FDR.
I think it's
Um,
post hoc.
okay,
Well,
I mean he's dead. So
posthumously, as in like after FDR's death. Okay, I
correct.
was thinking post hoc as in after the action taken.
Yeah, correct. So that also works. I was just talking about after his death, and as we decide whether or not
Sure.
what he was doing was right or wrong. Um, Basically, it was what he at the time, or he and his advisors, deemed needed in order to protect the country after this
Hmm.
foreign attack by a military might. And there was fear that anyone of Japanese ancestry might be a spy waiting to come out and stray do harm to a country
Hmm.
from within.
And I believe
So
suspicion of Russians was going to be a had probably carried similar weight during the Cold War, that
mhm,
there were spies and we don't know who the spies are, so how should we act towards the Russian people that are
yeah.
living in the U.S., even if they do have dual citizenship?
I mean, not only just Russians, but anyone expressing communist ideals. So the Red Scare was real, and
And I would
um,
contend is real, not necessarily coming from other countries, but it's something that's coming up from within again.
so the fear of communism. Yeah, I think we need to.
Let me bring in
Yeah,
a particular example from modern times along with that, and as it pertains to executive authority. Let's
mhm,
say that Andrew Yang, who at this point is not in the running for Democratic candidate, but one of the things that he was running on is universal basic income, saying everyone will receive $1,000 per month from the government. And that saying this is an executive order that I'm going to issue that everyone will start receiving money,
mhm,
ignoring the problems of buying people's votes. And a lot of people would argue that, oh, he's just literally promising cash for votes. That's buying a vote, which is anti democratic. Ignoring that, it is very much a communist ideology of you should
yeah.
depend on the government, and the government decides how dependent you will be. Giving out that money, is that within his executive authority?
I I'm not entirely sure. I haven't given enough thought if the president can make that singular statement and have it be upheld. I think there is.
So no, hold on. You just
Yeah,
combined two things. He can make
yeah.
the statement and have it be upheld. Those are two different things.
I think he can make the statement. Yes, I am. I'm fairly certain that there would be a lot of pushback from people that disagree with him in um,
I
the in the Senate, and then also there would most likely be Supreme Court cases that followed.
Yes, and so even if he makes that case, or if he makes that executive order, it may be the law on paper, or how it will be executed on paper. And the problem is he's actually making up a law in that case of ongoing from here to the foreseeable future. This is how it will be. This is actions that the government will take, and it's a
Mhm.
new action, not just a modification of an old action. Then it wouldn't have legal standing, because in general it's modifications of old actions and just choosing how to execute those. Giving out money, you could make a modification of, oh, well, only certain people qualify for government aid. Now I'm just
Mhm.
saying that everyone qualifies for government aid. That's my interpretation of the law.
Yeah.
That's how I'm going to execute it. And government aid is going to be a standard minimum $1,000. So that's an interpretation of the law and how to execute the law that would be within the purview of
Mhm.
what he can do judicially. I think that with the current climate, he would not have enough support in Congress to be able to pass that as a permanent law, particularly in that action, in
Mhm.
doing it as an executive order.
So, and I think we talked earlier about taking steps towards the end goal,
Hmm.
and that maybe in this case it may be more easily passed if he were to take the action of, okay, I'm going to just remove some of the restrictions on who can and can't get government aid. Okay, now that that's everyone's kind of okay with that, and they've tested the waters a little bit, let me just push it a little further, and a
Hmm.
little further,
Slowly
and
pushing the
also
Overton window.
right, and also as you do that, if one of those pushes gets overturned, then you don't go back to beginning, you just go back to wherever you
The
were
previous
before that.
step. Right.
So maybe it gets to 75% of the population is suddenly applicable and can get government aid. And then he's like, how about 80? And they're like, no. And it's like, okay, I guess 75% is good enough.
Hmm. Right. Doing as much as possible, but in slow steps, which
Yeah.
if the only way to get support from the rest of the government is to do it in those small steps, that's kind of the point of having the, well, not the point of having, but that is the self-limiting factor of unlimited executive
Mhm.
action, is that you can still only act in such a way that your underlings, as I'll refer to them, will support you in that regard.
Right. Um, yeah,
Now, what
that's very true.
happens if a large portion of at least your political faction agrees with the actions that you want to take? As an example that has been coming up recently is student loan debt.
Hmm.
Uh, Elizabeth Warren, who at the time of recording, and there's a lot of stuff in flux right now. Elizabeth Warren is one of the potential candidates for the Democratic primary. She said, I would take an executive action on day one or day two to forgive up to $50,000 of student loan debt for everyone that has student loans. There are going to be positives and negatives to that, but is she
Hmm.
within the purview of both her rights, uh, if she became president, and is she within the Overton window?
So
And
I,
then the third question of, would it be within the
yeah,
law?
I think it would be, I mean, the initial statement is within the law. And then more likely than not, there would be a significant pushback. Now, I'm not going to take I don't have a great feeling on how quickly that would happen, but I'm sure there would be a Supreme Court case either from one of the uh, major, like the debtors, the people who own all of that debt
Mm-hmm.
and are seeking payment for it. There would be definitely pushback from them saying this
Mm-hmm.
is you're taking away our money. This is money that we are owed. What the hell?
Right. That
So
it's not just saying you no longer owe this. Hey, we just gave you free money. It's also
mhm,
saying the money that other people had and that was lended is just
yeah, I
gone.
mean,
And
arguably, a lot of those companies that own that debt bought it for much less than what it's worth if it were to be paid back.
mhm.
So there are issues with that system, but I don't think we need to get into those right now.
No, I know, but I'm bringing it up as an example of
Hmm.
there are issues with the system. And if no actions or no major actions are being taken to fix that system, that could manifest itself as an emergency situation where
Hmm.
people can't agree to do anything and it's just sitting at a status quo. What if the status quo is viewed as an emergency? That you say student loan debt is an immediately pressing emergency.
Hmm. Then I think that you you kind of have to put yourself in the firing line if you are the president in that situation, and you need to completely overturn the status quo that has been. I mean, the status quo as it is now has been constantly under flux. It's not like things have been the same for the last 20 years. It's
Right.
every single year the cost to attend a university has gone up. The impact of student loan debt has gotten worse. Um, and the ability for students that want to go to university to pay their own way it's near impossible now.
Uh, there's reason for that, and it's partly because loans are given out from in the public sector. Public government loans are given out universally in general to people uh, based on their ability to, well, to my understanding, government loans are given based on how much money you have, not based on how much money you are expected to earn with your degree. Private loans, not necessarily. People can decline of saying, we don't expect you to be able to pay this off with that particular major, so we're not necessarily going to give you as much money. So part of the problem is actually caused by governments or the government universally giving out the same amount of money regardless of your ability to pay. So it could be argued that it's the government's fault that people are drastically in debt because they're supporting people in ways that, hey, here's a bunch of money, even though you won't be able to pay it back. So in that regard, it's the government's fault. Should the government then say, oh, actually, you don't have to pay that because we kind of screwed you over in the first place?
I mean, potentially that is an argument, and I think that's a discussion we can get into on another podcast, but like on another episode. But should a standing or sitting president be able to
make
a
that call.
statement?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think with that particular example, you look at it as the government issued out money and that was able to, well, that permitted people to now get an education, which is arguably good for the country. And now you say, oh, wait, you took an education that didn't make you employable enough to pay back the loan that we gave you, which is why you maybe were struggling to get private loans. Now you owe the government money and you can't pay it off. Okay, we'll just forgive that. That sounds like a reasonable solution, and particularly if there's no legislation that comes out about it. These people that are drastically in debt, that could be viewed as an emergency, so forgiving that debt could be a reasonable and arguable, well, defendable action taken by the executive officer. But then you have to look at it from the perspective of where that money was supposed to be going to, is you borrowed that money to pay to colleges. And if you now say, if the government says, actually, you don't owe us that money, what happens to the money? What is actually erased? Because if you say, oh, we're just going to take that money out of the pocket of the school that we sent you to, then the school is out the money and you've now harmed the school. And if you say, well, we'll just take it from other taxpayers, then you're forcing other people to pay tax dollars, and it could be argued as a misallocation of taxes. So all of that simple action of just saying, we're going to eliminate your debt, that money has to come from somewhere, and it would be up to the Congress to make the determination of just how unconstitutional that action would be.
So taking an action that isn't just forgiving, but maybe addressing one of the larger issues with the current system, in that maybe the taking a step towards things, basically saying interest rates. So saying with an executive order that student loan interest rates must not exceed 1% or something along those lines.
Or let's take it to the extreme. No more from this point forward, or every loan from here on out that is more than 5 years old, you're no longer allowed to collect interest on, to limit the amount of profit, because if nothing is happening, I'm just going to limit the profit, but not reverse the profit. And so that would be deemed maybe more constitutional.
It works, I guess, better in that all the money that people are owed is still being owed, but it's just not going to be increasing over time per person. The only way to then get more money would be to have more people get debt. And
I think that's an example of saying everyone gets $50,000 back for free is negatively affects the people that were owed that money. And if you take the money from taxes, then it negatively affects all of the rest of the country that are actively paying taxes. So it negatively affects people, whereas taking an action where after a certain point, you're no longer allowed to collect interest on it, that negatively affects the person that was owed the money, but, well, it doesn't negatively affect them. It prevents any additional positive effect from happening to them, which
it reduces the ability of them to abuse the way that things are.
Sure, because then they'll just raise interest rates for those first 5 years.
Yeah.
And bringing it back to kind of the original discussion of executive power, I think both of those actions are within the executive power of the U.S. president. But if, in this case, Elizabeth Warren decided, I'm just going to give a full forgiveness, that would be outside of the Overton window and would probably be overturned by the rest of Congress. Whereas if she said, well, after a certain point, no additional interest, that might be just within the extremes of the Overton window that it would not get overturned.
Right. And like, I guess forgiving, I guess after the fact, post hoc, changing the interest rates of all current student loans to be, if they're government issued, just 0%. If they're private issued, saying they can't be higher than a certain percentage, because hey, if you sought a private loan, there's a certain precedent there of hey, you went out of the standard bounds.
Absolutely. But I think that with the idea of executive privilege, that second option of just saying you will only be able to charge X amount of interest, and saying that as a new law is actually less valid than saying I forgive all student loans. That in terms of executive power, the authority is point actions, not setting precedents of what the law is. Saying I forgive all student loan is within the realm of power. It will probably get reversed because it's outside of the Overton window, but the power still remains for that particular action. If she says, I'm just going to change the interest rate on all of those loans and all future loans, that is setting a precedence and making up a new law that says you are not allowed to give out any new loans at this particular interest rate or at any interest rate. Having that control requires legal and judicial backing, which executive branch does not have. It's point actions, not precedential actions.
In with the example earlier of Donald Trump blocking entry into the United States from any one of those 7 countries, that's setting a precedent that is long-standing, saying if you are a citizen of these countries, you cannot enter from here on forward. And there was no end date set on there. It wasn't until this date or until this time or until this countrywide goal has been set, then you can't enter. But after that point, yeah, go ahead.
And in this particular case, it was deemed unconstitutional
initially, and then it was overturned, and then a very similar executive order was put out that is now still in effect, and it was slightly changed wherein if you hold U.S. citizenship, you can enter. If you have dual citizenship of one of the banned countries and then another country that is not banned, you can enter. And the ability to re-enter if you had been a resident of the United States.
But I think that's still a perfect example of an action was taken saying this is the precedent I want to set, or this is the rule of this is what I want to actually do to apply what I believe is in defense of the Constitution and of the nation. If that's later deemed unconstitutional, okay, that will be reversed. And I think in the example that I was giving of Warren saying, here is what the interest rate will be, that will probably end up being overturned because you're trying to set a precedence, while the loans at that time may be subject to that interpretation and that execution of the current loan laws and lending laws. The effect would only be until Congress makes an interpretation of it. And choosing not to interpret or not to contest it means it's being upheld currently, even if it gets overturned later. So I think that making the argument that I made a couple minutes ago that, oh, well, saying the laws is precedential, so it's not within the power. Technically, it is saying this is how we will execute the law is within the power of the executive branch, even if it will be later overturned. And what happens to the person in executive power after they've made a decision or put forth an executive action or executive order that gets overturned, there may be negative consequences for it, saying you overstepped your bounds and we disagree with you to the point of you put the country at risk, you're a continuing risk, and we're removing you from office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I fully agree with your statement that executive orders can't be setting precedent.
That's
your analysis under that assumption.
My original argument said that, but I followed it up with a more recent argument of originally I was saying precedential orders cannot be given. But no, precedential orders can be given because executive orders, in some regards, unlimited or only limited by the Overton window and the degree to which people are willing to execute orders within the Overton window. So you're only limited by that, but you can make whatever executive orders you want, even if they're later deemed as unconstitutional. So I think different levels of issues with giving an executive order would be: you can give one that everyone agrees with, or at least enough people agree with to be executed. You can give one that people temporarily agree with and then is later overturned. And then you can give one that people somewhat agree with, are willing to execute, gets overturned, and then you're removed from office because, holy crap, you should not have given that order. And then you have the ones where people won't even execute it because it's out of the Overton window, like the killing the firstborn child.
Right. And I mean, there's precedent for impeachment if for a president that abuses their power. I mean, abuse of power is an impeachable offense, and going too far with an executive order could be considered, abuse of power.
I don't completely agree with that, at least on what the current precedent is in the U.S. Abuse of power has not been deemed, as far as I know, an impeachable offense. The argument, again, at the time of recording, the impeachment inquiry is still going on, under the argument of abuse of power. But the question is more abuse of power for self-interest and thus for treasonous interest. The reason that Trump is being put on trial for impeachment is saying, well, you used executive privilege, or at least you were using your power in the executive office to investigate an opponent and undermine the democratic process. So it's abuse of power to undermine the nation, which is not abuse of power. It's not just the abuse of power that the argument is being made to remove him from office. It's the fact that it was being used against the country.
So abuse of power is an impeachable offense. And in this case, withholding military aid to the Ukraine unless they launch an investigation into Joe Biden, that is, arguably, that's definitely an abuse of power.
That's the argument that's currently being had, and I don't think that that's probably a complete discussion on its own. So I don't think that we should get into that or even try to tackle that here. It's more of that's what's trying to be decided in the courts, or not in the courts, in Congress right now. But abuse of power outside of the Overton window is what's being argued. Is the action that was taken, is it outside of the Overton window to the point where he is a danger to the country? And can we, how do I phrase this? Well, also verifying that action was taken. So there are some people that question that the claims being made against Trump, that's in question of, well, how much of this is actually true? And then the question is raised of, if it is true, okay, is that outside of the Overton window? And if that's true, is it far enough outside of the Overton window that it is against the will of the country, or what we view as what the country stands for, that we should remove him from office to prevent him from making further actions? So I think that's how I see the impeachment playing into this particular question, is exactly where do you fall on that line? Because it sounds to me like everything that we're saying is executive power is a very broad spectrum that can drastically swing from one direction to the right, but it's a spectrum that goes infinitely in each direction, which is why executive power has to be unlimited, so that you can take actions wherever you are on that particular line. But if you take actions that are too far out of what is deemed acceptable, then you may lose your underlings' support in actually executing what those decisions are.
All right. So I think we covered that topic pretty well.
I agree.
The last thing that I wanted to talk about is a little bit, it falls under the similar umbrella as executive orders, but specifically the ability and the power of clemency for um, sitting presidents, the ability to pardon single or large groups of people at a whim, and
I
whether or not that those should be able to be overturned. To my knowledge, a pardon has never been overturned,
mhm.
um, but there are cases and arguments for situations where
Sh-
maybe it should have been.
and I think
uh,
that still falls under the purview of kind of where we came to, is that if you pardon someone that is such a hardened criminal that the people will refuse to enforce it, of like, this person murdered 10,000 people
mhm,
and said, you're throwing me in jail, but as soon as I'm out, I'm going to try to kill more people. The, the president can pardon that person, but it would destroy his reputation, and it's likely not to be enforced. So again, the pardon, I think, is only valid within the Overton window, and the Overton window for pardons is probably significantly wider than maybe many of the other actions that can be taken, because it usually only affects a few individuals, and that is the individuals being pardoned. So
right.
saying I have an executive order that will give free money to everyone is going to affect a lot more people than I am going to pardon that guy over there in prison.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm going to use the example of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. So, Richard Nixon was being impeached
Mm-hmm.
and decided to leave office before it actually came to fruition.
Yep.
And the very first thing that Gerald Ford did after he became president, following Richard Nixon's leaving the office, he pardoned Nixon.
Yep.
And this was right before Nixon could be indicted in the Watergate scandal.
Yep.
So is that is that something that should or is that something that could have been overturned or should have been overturned?
So
Because we have a president that has done some a pretty bad thing that it
mhm.
arguably is against the democratic process of this country.
So I think that's a good example. Uh, should it have been overturned? That is what the Congress of the time answered. They, to my
Mhm.
understanding, they did not overturn it, right?
They did not.
Okay, so they did not overturn it. Therefore, that was the decision. That was what was
Yeah.
made. He was pardoned, and he was no longer guilty of that crime in the eyes of the law. Should that should it they be should the person in with executive power be able to do that? I think yes, because again, you need the point power of saying a decision needs to be made. I am going
Mhm.
to make that decision, and if that decision is outside of the Overton window, where Congress will overturn it, or my decision will be reversed and all the actions taken will be undone to the best of people's ability, okay, that means that is where the line is drawn. But drawing that line is very, very difficult for Congress, because you need a lot of people to agree on it. And
Mhm.
so that's what I mean by the Overton window is very wide when it comes to executive authority, particularly because of how hard it is to draw the lines of where the Overton window is, and how blurry it is of we don't know exactly where those lines are. But it is within the right of the president, to who has basically unlimited authority, or unlimited judicial power, to act on the law. And if they make an attempt at carrying out an action or a law that is way outside of the Overton window, that is a risk that they are permitted to take, even if the privilege to take those actions is removed. Which is
Mhm.
why, by the way, generally you only see pardons at the very end of the presidency, because you're risking your reputation on those pardons. So because
Yeah,
you know that
usually in the
I'm
last
probably
term.
probably going to be outside of the Overton window at this point,
Yeah.
so I'm going to do it quickly, before while people are about to not care about me anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not going to say end of the presidency. I'm going to say the end of if there isn't a belief that they'll be reelected,
Yeah.
or in the or just in the last term, so second terms.
Or maybe like, hey, I
you don't
was
need to
running,
worry
I
about
might be
being,
reelected. Oh,
yeah.
I lost the election, but I'm still president for 2 months. You can then pardon people. So,
Mhm.
yeah. As for pardons, should they be able to do it? Yes, because it needs to be unlimited. You need to be able to take point actions to protect the country potentially.
Mhm.
But should that be able to be overturned? Yes. It doesn't mean that they will be overturned. And if you pardon individuals that are too far outside of the acceptable people to pardon, then you're outside of the Overton window, and it will likely get overturned. So I think, again, it comes back to the result that we ended up coming to is
So yeah, that's you're continue with what you're saying. Sorry, I
no,
cut you off.
and that's fine. I was just going to say that to kind of sum up again, regardless of the action taken, whether that be pardoning or forgiving student loans or
Hmm.
whatever that may entail, or limiting interest rates, you are taking an action that is recognized as, yeah, you can pretty much do whatever you want. But the more extreme you go relative to what is deemed currently acceptable, the more likely it is to be overturned. And if you go way off to an extreme,
Hmm.
then you risk being removed from office to prevent you from making similar unacceptable decisions.
Yeah. So to answer an earlier question of mine that I had, um, it it's not completely agreed on whether or not a presidential pardon can be overturned at all.
Okay.
Unlike executive orders, they do stand separate. Um, Executive orders can be overturned if the Supreme Court or Congress decides and agrees on that, or if it is found unconstitutional.
Okay.
With pardons, there it is generally accepted that they can't be overturned, but it's never actually been tested. If I'm reading this
Right,
article
because the
correctly.
precedent hasn't been set for that, which means even if a precedent has been set, it could
Hmm.
be overturned in the future if it goes way outside.
Yeah.
If we had Hitler in jail and someone pardoned him, and up until that point, pardons could not be questioned, I'm sure there would be
Hmm.
a large group of people that would say, let's rethink this whole not overturning
Yeah.
pardons thing.
Yeah. I mean, you may not be able to overturn the pardon that has been made, but future pardons may be would be overturnable. So,
Exactly.
in the one question that I have for you is, should pardons only take effect after someone's been convicted of a crime, or could you pardon someone before they've been convicted and just say, "Yeah, there's no
Either.
point in even starting this legal battle"?
Both.
No,
Because,
both,
again, I
either.
think with where we're kind of, the idea that we're kind of converging onto is
Mhm.
executive power needs to be infinite, but is limited by what is deemed acceptable at the time.
So limited infinity.
Yes. Executive power is in practice infinite. It's not infinitely limited, because that would be
Yeah.
very strictly defined. I'm trying to think of a term for it. Um, it is constrained but unbounded. That
Yeah.
it's constrained in the sense that you can only take certain actions, but the list of actions that you can take is infinitely malleable
Yes.
depending on the situation.
Yeah.
You only have control of where you go within those constraints, but the situation that you're in is infinitely malleable. So
Hmm.
the constraints that you're subject to are what's infinite.
Right. It is. Yeah. It is countably infinite. Um. But it and yeah
Dealing
is.
with infinities is fun.
Yep.
But yeah, I think constrained but infinite is a good way
Yeah.
to say
Yep.
that's how executive power should be.
Yep.
Cool.
I think that's the case.
I think we covered everything. Anything else?
Uh. No, not for me.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Hi everyone! Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.